right now. And yeah, but so I'm very happy to have Troy be giving a presentation. And also I was very happy to hear that Troy invited Mitch Horowitz as a respondent. But I think I will leave it to Troy to introduce Mitch, and then also to kind of take the lecture away.
Cool. So for Mitch's benefit then, I sent Mitch an email and said, would you like to join us? I did not give a lot more context. So Mitch, where you are is in a meeting of an architectural advisory board for the Bабin Yaar Holocaust Memorial Foundation. It's a project that's been going on for a few years now with the ambition of making a museum or something similar to commemorate, memorialize, develop scholarship around, and also do a kind of forensic research around the Holocaust by bullets in Ukraine. And so I was lucky enough to be asked by Nick and Anna to join this board under the directorship of Ilya, who you can see next to Anna there, who's the kind of new director as of, I think, the last year, and really kind of picking up the speed of the project. And so our job is to kind of help give advice how to think architecturally and so on to these people that are already very qualified to do so themselves. On the board, we're missing Marina, who's an architect and a scholar and historian and theorist based in Rotterdam. But we have Inez Weissman, who runs the PhD program at the RCA in London and is a scholar and historian. Robert Jan van Pelt, who's a professor at Waterloo and kind of the world's preeminent Holocaust and architecture expert. And today we're joined by Elizabeth Onstedt, who gave us a kind of guest presentation a couple of weeks ago, who's a kind of expert on burial practices and so on. And I'm going to give a talk today on burial practices, but I'm not an expert at all. And so one of the reasons I wanted to invite you, Mitch, was you actually know a lot more about the genre of thing I'm going to be talking about now than I do. And the thought was sort of like, I'll give a presentation, I'll sort of like poke at a few things related to maybe the way that I think about burial practices and how we might open up thinking about them. And hopefully that might stimulate some thoughts for yourself and others. And then we basically, for everyone else, Mitch is one of the most kind of generous and deep thinkers I know, which usually doesn't come together in the same person. Mitch is, amongst many things, he's a scholar of the occult, and I had the pleasure of getting to meet him just over a year ago at the Guggenheim at an event about UFOs and magic. And we kind of stayed in touch, and we're getting to know each other, and then COVID happened, and I haven't seen him in a while. So any opportunity to get to see Mitch's face is exciting, and this is one of them. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, oh, hang on one second. Yeah, share my screen. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Okay, cool. I might try to close another window so I save some memory on my machine. Okay. Full screen, can you still see it? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so the talk is called Tombs and Wombs. In 1910, in an essay, a quite seminal essay simply called Architecture, the Austrian architect Adolf Loos said, "If we find a mound 6 feet long and 3 feet wide in the forest, formed into a pyramid, shaped by a shovel, we become serious, and something says, someone lies buried here. Now that is architecture." In the same essay, he quite famously said that only tombs and monuments are part of the art that is architecture. Around the same time, he was building across the street from this building. So this is the Hofburg Imperial Palace in Vienna. It's a sort of neoclassical masterpiece that was built over 7 centuries. Here you can see it in plan. And then right across the street, or on the other side of the plaza, was a plot that Loos was given to do a kind of department store in 1910. And this is what he came up with. 1 second. Can't find my mouse. Sorry, okay, there we go. Okay, anyways, I can't really see my screen, so apologies. Anyway, so this is what he came up with. This is the Loos house, or the Goldman and Selleck building. And basically it was a total scandal. So the base of the building was a kind of stripped down neoclassical ornament, but the top of it was basically naked. It was this literally kind of skin colored building that looked like it had its trousers down, or as critics of the time argued, it looked sort of like a sewage grate. And so you can imagine the kind of outrage of putting this sort of proto-modernist building before the age of modernism across the street. I'm the only person in the world that still has a landline.
Oh, I have a landline. There's okay. Two of us. Yeah.
Okay. I'll call you sometime.
Please.
Where was I? Criticism, right. So the criticism of the building was quite pervasive. But strangely, Loos himself was actually, I think, less radical than his critics. In a lecture he gave in 1911 about the building, he made the argument that it wasn't a kind of radical departure, but it was actually based on the model of the Parthenon. So the kind of interior of the Parthenon, where you had this marble, ornate, lower interior facade, capped by this kind of orthogonal, austere, coffered ceiling. And so basically, I feel like the reason I'm starting here is because I think Loos did kind of two things. I'm not a historian of Loos. There are people on the call that know way more about him than I do. But my interpretation is basically that what Loos helped to do with this building and with his writing at the same time was sort of normalize modern architecture in a way that allowed this sort of austere, naked design to enter into culture because it wasn't austere and naked entirely. It actually came with an aura. And I think that's why the tombs and monuments aspect is quite significant. He wrote a very famous essay just before that building in 1908. And this is where not seeing my screen is going to make it difficult. Where he says, the revolution of culture is synonymous with the removal of ornamentation from objects of everyday use. The poppin covers everything he can lay his hands on, with ornament, from his face and body to his bow and canoe. But today, tattoos are a sign of degeneracy and only seen on criminals and degenerate aristocrats. People of culture, in contrast to the poppins, a face without tattoos is more beautiful than one with tattoos, even if they had been designed by Michelangelo. So, made his politics quite clear. But I'm not interested in his politics, and I'm not interested in a sort of retroactive cancel culture, statue toppling identity politics of where modern architecture, how it's haunted. I'm more interested in how it has a kind of baked into its roots. And I think this goes much further than just Loos, even though I think I'm using him here as a kind of cipher or prototype, archetype. I think it has a kind of faulty metaphysics. And I think this is where you see it very kind of blatantly. And in particular for Loos, the images I was showing above that quote were coming in part from Caesar, from Lombroso. Loos was also a follower of Nordau. And these were kind of like the worst of the worst when it came to kind of proto-eugenics and the strain of thinking that leads to concepts of the degenerate and eventually helps to undergird the idea that you could take a people, the Jews, and put them in concentration camps in Central Europe, right? And one of the places that this comes from is Ernst Haeckel's idea of the recapitulation thesis, the slogan of which is sort of this idea of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. It's basically the idea that the stages of the development of an organism in its kind of embryological phases resembled successive adult stages in its remote ancestors. And so in this sort of like ersatz Darwinism, you get the seeds for thinking about a kind of social Darwinism or the kind of development of cultural complexity that can be seen on someone's face or the color of their skin or the shape of their head and so on. And what I want to put forward today is that Loos is not just a bad person to think about burial practices with, but he is because his his metaphysics are bad, and I think there's a better metaphysics that's actually literally just a rhyme away from this, which is the idea that ontogeny recapitulates cosmogony, which would be the idea that the genesis of the being reflects the genesis of the cosmos, or as Tyson Yunkaporta, an indigenous knowledge holder and professor in Australia, puts it in a recent book. The whole is intelligent, and each part carries an inherent intelligence of the entire system. Knowledge is therefore a living thing that is patterned within every person and being and object and phenomenon within creation. His ideas are common. This idea of a kind of holographic epistemology, as Manulani Aluli-Meyer puts it in a 2013 essay. As she says, this is a kind of common thinking across traditional cultures around the world, indigenous cultures, Aboriginal cultures. And in this chart, she kind of she shows what she means by that. And a holographic epistemology has to go beyond just body and mind. It has to incorporate a third entity, which she calls spirit. And here she's showing all the different ways that that kind of tripartite epistemology shows up in different cultures around the world, whether it's coarse, subtle, and secret, or knowing, knowledge, and understanding, or words that I can't pronounce. There is this kind of sense that the type of epistemology that Tyson Yunkaporta is talking about, and she's talking about, has to account for spirit. And in Western culture, I think this is something we've lost. I'm not going to go back and rehearse the kind of Cartesian split. But basically, I don't think it's something that never existed in the West, and I'll show that throughout the process, throughout the presentation. But it seems like something that a sophistication and a complex understanding has been lost to the mainstream and sort of survived in an esoteric or occulted kind of strand. Yet it is kind of coming back. And it's coming back in strange ways. So now it's like the US Department of Defense is telling us with a straight face that they're tracking UFOs, right? Or the more kind of also recently, this kind of resurgence in studies of the mind through psychedelics. And in particular, one of the sort of flag bearers of that renaissance has been Roland Griffiths at the Johns Hopkins lab. And I saw a presentation of his that this is a photograph from a couple of years ago. And he's now shifted from looking at psilocybin as a way of dealing with end-of-life trauma to actually cataloging the types of spirit encounters people have on psychedelic drugs. Another example of how science is picking this up is Andrew Gallimore, who's a professor of neuroscience or neuroscience researcher in a university in Japan. And this from a recent book, he's sort of illustrated how the kind of cortical columns in the brain, which a number of neuroscientists think, basically it's like neurons that fire together, wire together, and they tend to kind of wire together in these vertical columns that seem to sort of give an architecture to the way that our brain filters what's coming from our sensory inputs. He's found that if you put that brain on psilocybin or LSD or other kind of classic psychedelics, it allows different parts of the brain to talk to each other. And so you get this sort of opening of awareness and so on. But DMT in particular, and exclusively, it works entirely differently. It actually entirely restructures this architecture. And so his argument is that this would be a kind of scientific way of explaining how under the influence of DMT, people are in a truly completely different world, experiencing completely different things. So science is starting to kind of poke at this. And yet we still, it seems in the West, in a kind of mainstream discourse, stumble with the language with how to talk about these things beyond what they look like under a microscope or to a scientist. So for example, Michael Pollan, who I think I just mentioned, wrote a book 2 years ago that was quite popular called How to Change Your Mind, where he chronicles this sort of resurgence of psychedelic research. And even a writer as eloquent and capable as Michael Pollan, who is writing about his own experiences in altered states of consciousness, has to still revert to a 19th century idea, the idea of William James of the ineffable, right? That we can't put this into words, there's no language for it. And it's really a shame because there is language for it. We just have to go outside of the West, I think, to find some of that language. So for example, there are cultures around the world that have been dealing with these experiences for literally thousands of years, and developing sophisticated kind of linguistic and cognitive technology for making sense of them, and learning from them and incorporating them into culture and practice. In particular, the Amazon, I think, is an interesting place to start. What's showing in this kind of chart is just the psychotropic compounds that are in active use for different cultures around the world, and their potency. And you can see the big red column there in Native American, where they have 49 different compounds they use, and they're incredibly hallucinogenic. An example of that would be Pablo Amarengo. So Amarengo was recently passed away, but he was a shaman in the Shipibo tradition in Peru. And he had a photographic memory, and he would paint the scenes that he encountered in his ayahuasca experiences. And this is an example of one of them. If I were like a 20th century intellectual, one day I'd want to give a whole hour-long lecture on this one image alone, because I think you could do it. But basically I'm using it as a stand-in to jump to the next point, which is a kind of definition of shamanism. And a quick caveat, shamanism comes from Mircea Eliade's research in the steppe region in Russia. And basically it universalizes this idea of the Saman. And so it's not exactly the right term, but you get what I'm saying. And it's become a kind of term for this kind of archetypal figure of, as Jeremy Narby puts it, the person who, in profession and in the name of the community, entertains an intermittent commerce with the spirits of nature. These are literally the people that are doing this on a regular basis. And not only are they doing it on a regular basis, they come from traditions that have been doing it for thousands of years on a regular basis, and handing down those traditions and literally those relationships from one to the next. And again, going back to some research by Jeremy Narby, an anthropologist, he's sort of enumerated from a number of kind of peoples in the Amazon, the Yaminua, Ashaninka, Piro, Yanomami, and so on, commonalities in the ways that they talk about what we would call in English the word spirit. The idea that everything that's alive has a spirit, and when you don't have a spirit, you're... So those spirits are not immaterial, they're just invisible. And of course, this would come from this practice of regularly being able to change consciousness and see things that are not there for everyday consciousness. But it's not just that, it's also this, that they can cause you harm. They can do you pain. The Yanomami shamans talk about backs when they're older, because the Shapiri spirits effectively like to attack them, and they regularly attack them in the back. So these are people with back pain at the end of their life. These spirits are universal and relational. They're the aspects of living things that actually connect us all together. They're scaleless, so you can have a spirit for an individual person, you can have a spirit for a whole species, you can have a spirit for a landform, you can have a spirit for a weather pattern. And in a lot of cases, they come across as humanoid. They're literally in the shape of humans. And as you can see here, the trees with the faces. They connect earth and sky. As I mentioned earlier, they're inherited from elders. And finally, and this is why I'm bringing them up in this presentation about burial practices, they incorporate both human and non-human ancestors. So dealing with the spirits is part of the practice of dealing with the dead for people that do this on a regular basis. Going back to Meyer's chart, in terms of body, mind, spirit, the other kind of tripartite element that I think is really worth kind of focusing on is this idea of facts, logic, and metaphor. And again, I think we have this kind of sophistication in Western cultures with facts and logic, but I think there's something to be learned about how to operate with metaphor. And going back to Tyson Yunkaporta, he says, and the book is called Sand Talk, which is a kind of Aboriginal Australian way of communicating and sharing knowledge, creating knowledge by literally drawing lines in the sand and having conversations and interrogating them. And so the drawing on the top of the page is a drawing that he had worked on for a while to kind of incorporate a number of different aspects of thinking. And so he says, the circle on the left represents the abstract world of mind and spirit, and the circle on the right represents the concrete world of land, relationships, and activity. The lines above and below show the lines of communication between these worlds, which occur through metaphors. These metaphors include images, dance, song, language, culture, objects, rituals, gestures, and more. And then finally, he says, metaphors are the language of spirit. An example of that, and again, this goes back to Jeremy Narby's research, would be in the Yaminwa concept of the Koshuti, which is the Yaminwa shamans, when they go, when they have their encounters with ayahuasca, the practice they go through and through their, the kind of initiatory practice for a young shaman is to go into altered states of consciousness, commune with the spirits, and to do that by learning their songs. And the way you learn their songs is you copy their songs. And the language of those songs, which is spoken in their language, is in part it's in their language, but it has a different form to it. It's a form they call sa-yoshto yoshto, which is basically this idea of what it means is language twisting. You can't talk about anything in a kind of frontal, purely descriptive way. So for example, a jaguar is referred to as a basket because the pattern on a jaguar's skin resembles the pattern on certain baskets. An anaconda is referred to as a hammock because it slings from the trees. Fish are referred to as white-colored peccaries because of the gills on them. And as they, sorry, there we go. As one of them says here, with my Koshuti, I want to see. Singing, I carefully examine things. Twisted language brings me close, but not too close. With normal words, I would crash into things. With twisted ones, I circle around them. I can see clearly. It's basically, yeah. The idea is by using this kind of rhyming slang, they're developing a specific language of spirit. So it's not just any old metaphor. It's the idea of employing metaphor in order to describe and then speak with and then learn from spirit. And I'm gonna show this clip. I think I do have time for this because I don't want this to feel like I'm sort of exoticizing the other or, and I also don't want it to feel like the types of things that I'm sharing and that I'll share next are primitive or dusty or unsophisticated. I think they're actually profoundly sophisticated. And I want to show what I think is maybe one of the best attempts from recent Western culture to describe precisely the same practice. So this is about 3 minutes. Yeah, this is a clip from the movie Interstellar.
Love towards love. My connection, Claire, it is quantifiable. It's the key. What are we here to do? Find out, tell her. The watch. The watch. That's it. We code the data into the movement of the second hand. Dollars. Translate that into Morse and feed it to me. Translating data to Morse. Cooper, what if she never came back for it? She will. She will. Murph, I can see his car! He's coming, Murph!
Okay, I'm coming down.
How do you know? Because I gave it to her. Roger Morse, dot, dot, dash, dot. Dot, dot. Dash, dot. Dot, dash, dot, dot.
So if you haven't seen the film, basically what he's doing is he's trapped in a kind of multidimensional space-time loop where he's able to communicate with his daughter in the past. And the way he does it is by kind of reaching across the void and finding a way to communicate. And this is just, it's an image I want you to hold in your mind as I'm going through the rest of the presentation. It's saccharine and kind of dorky, but I think it's it's something I keep in mind when I'm doing this research, because I think it's, how to put it? I mean, the way to put it maybe is, if you've experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. Now, again, going back to the idea of kind of thinking almost scientifically about metaphor, the art of metaphor, Eduardo Kohn, in a recent book called How Forests Think, relays how the Runa people, again from the Amazon basin, this time in Ecuador, I believe, their experience of these entheogenic and psychedelic encounters. And from their perspective, what happens for them in the state of dreaming or in the state of altered states of consciousness is that the forest goes from this sort of wild and craggy and high fidelity and dangerous place, and it becomes a kind of cartoon version of itself. That's how it's referred to. It becomes a kind of cartoon version. And or you could say it becomes a kind of down-sampled kind of cartoon or metaphor of what the forest really is. And in that book, Kohn says, and what Kohn says is, the literal refers to a customary interpretation of the world internal to a given domain. Metaphor, by contrast, is used to align the situated points of view of beings who inhabit different worlds. So what he's saying is that the literal is something that is the experience we have when we're in one domain, a kind of fixed domain, and we are communicating with that which is in the same domain. But when we want to communicate across domains, metaphor becomes the means by which we do that, because it's the only way that we can do it, because we're talking about something that is, again, it's more than ineffable. Using ineffable is it's like using snow for an Eskimo, right? There's better words for this, and metaphor is the way to maintain the kind of multidimensional kaleidoscopic nature of what one encounters in those other states of consciousness and brings them back. Specifically, then for humans, the dreaming world is a metaphorical one, whereas the waking world is a literal one. But for spirit masters or beast masters, the sort of top of the food chain of the spirit world in the jungle, it's the exact opposite. And so again, this is where that kind of sophistication of metaphor, I think, can be learned from other cultures, and that we can build on, think about, we might think smartly about burial practices. Going back to Yonkaporta, and I'm going to use quotes from Yonkaporta throughout this, because I think it's really the most lucid description of what's going on here and applies across many different cultures. He says, creation is not an event in the distant past, but something that is continually unfolding and needs custodians to keep it co-creating, to keep co-creating it by linking the two worlds together via metaphors and cultural practice. So it's not just that we can operate with metaphor, it's our job. This is what it means to be human. We're supposed to be stitching those two worlds together. So for example, with the Runa, if you're dreaming and you kill a pig, remember a cartoon pig, and therefore much easier to hunt, then when you get back into a waking state of consciousness, the group will organize a hunting party, because you actually, not just is the animal soul blind and therefore kind of hobbled and easy to hunt, but it's your job as the human to reconnect those two sides of thinking, of being, right? It's your job to stitch together those two parts of the cosmos, the dreaming and the waking world. A similar thing, I think it can be said to happen in Shipibo culture, where a lot of the kind of visuals that one encounters under influence of DMT and ayahuasca are exactly the things that they stitch into their artifacts and so on. I want to give a couple examples from Western culture to show that this is a kind of common practice, this idea of literally kind of journaling one's dreams and the effects of it. So J.R.R. Tolkien in the early 20th century spent decades developing Middle Earth. And it started with a series of maps. It even had its own kind of cycles of the moon and so on. He was developing a kind of timing cycle to understand space and time. He developed a multi-millennia genealogy of all the different types of cultures and species and so on. They even had their own languages. He was a philologist. I think he invented something like 22 different languages in the course of developing Middle Earth, and even a system of kind of sigils and magic, and even crafted fragments of kind of lost holy books. And in doing so, he basically created a whole universe that was then obviously written down in the sort of, mythical book, the Red Book of Westmarch, which was the kind of core of two of the most kind of seminal pieces of 20th century fictional literature, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. In an essay, or a lecture essay that he gave in the early 20th century, called On Fairy Stories, Tolkien said the primary world, reality of elves and men is the same, if differently valued and perceived. This was the basis of his thinking. It was that he wrote the books, but the books were what he called the product of subcreation. It wasn't just him making things up. It wasn't just coming out of his imagination. It was something that was welling up from the imaginal, and it came out of a practice of regularly constructing this world that was coming to him partly through dream and partly through imagination. Another example of that from precisely the same time that was only made public very recently was Carl Jung's process of developing his Red Book. In 1913, Jung was on a train coming back from visiting his mother in Switzerland, and he was hit with a kind of involuntary vision. It was a kind of yellow wave that was rushing over and swallowing Europe that then kind of turned to blood red, leaving just Switzerland as a kind of untouched island in the middle. The vision came back to him again, and so he started to meditate on the vision, trying to call that vision back up in his mind's eye. And he did this day after day, literally for 20 years, starting with that initial vision. And over time, calling that vision up into his imagination, and then going through the process of journaling it, drawing it, writing it down, and then attempting to reboot his imagination the next day with those kind of, with the images that he was able to pull out of his mind. Eventually, those images started to reanimate. He called it active imagination, and it was a process whereby he was literally able to kind of close his eyes and go into a dreaming state. And as he did that, a number of these images that you see on the page on the screen in front of you started to come to him. And in particular, a number of images that he later realized were actually common figures in Western alchemy. And so this, for Jung, which I think this began when he was around 37 or 38 years old, he claims that this moment was his, what he called his numinous beginning. This was from which everything else came, the collective unconscious, the anima and the animus, the things for which we think of and know Jung as Jung, the archetypes, were the product of this sort of imagination process, this dreaming process. And at the end of it all, the one aspect of it that he actually published during his lifetime, the 7 Sermons of the Dead, were basically the kind of summary revelation of this kind of massive period of kind of summoning the collective unconscious. And the way that this came to him, he was at home, I think in his countryside home, and he said he felt the air thicken with spirit. And then he heard the doorbell ring, and there was nobody at the door. And he heard the doorbell ring again, and there was nobody at the door. And then they came to him. And basically this throng of kind of entities or spirits basically conversed with Jung. And the 7 Sermons to the Dead were the result. And basically what he said was that he recognized, the reason it was called the 7 Sermons to the Dead is because he recognized that, or what they told him was that they were the dead, and they were on their way back from Jerusalem where they didn't find what they were looking for. And so this sort of, it left doubt in Jung's mind as to what the collective unconscious really was, and if it was maybe just a string of ancestors or string of the dead. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to throw up some slogans as I go that I think kind of add on to the kind of general framework, which is this idea that ontogeny recapitulates cosmogony. And so what this one is imitation instigates initiation, right? It's the idea that by miming, by copying, it's like with my 2-year-old daughter, I know she's hearing me and understanding when she does back to me what I do to her. And basically the idea is that it's the same process on the other side of the veil. Going back to Yunkaporta then, he gives, I think, a really good understanding of how to think about metaphor. And he gives an example through smoke. He says, here's how the smoke works. It's made by the leaves, light from sky camp and nutrients from under the ground, connecting the two worlds and moving between them, visible but intangible. You have to feel it going through you, through your body, and particularly through the big spirit at the center of your belly. The smoke is liminal, neither earth nor air, but part of both. So it moves across the same spaces in between as shadow spirits do, sending them on their way. I think you could take what he says about smoke, which is effectively that it is what it does and it does what it is, and apply it to other things as well. So for example, I think it's a way to think about both caves and corpses. One of the oldest, maybe the oldest burial that we found, a kind of ritual burial of Homo sapiens, is the double burial in Israel at the cave in Kafse, which is about 100,000 years old, where it was two people buried together. It looked like a mother and a daughter, and their bodies and their bones rather were caked in red ochre, so they were actually dressed to be buried in the kind of edge of the cave. But it wasn't just Homo sapiens. So even before them, Neanderthals were thought to bury their dead in shallow graves with grave goods and ornamentation. And I think this is significant because a couple of years ago, in 2017, in the southwest of France, in a Neanderthal cave, deep within a kind of deep cavern, it was discovered this area, in a cave that was only ever inhabited by Neanderthals, where you basically have what looks like a ritual circle with two hearths in the middle. So if this were just for keeping warm inside the cave, you probably don't need two fires, and you probably don't need a ritualistic, symbolic circle going around it. So it seems that Neanderthals were not just burying their dead, but also tapping into some other states of consciousness. And even further back than Neanderthals, in the Rising Star cave system in the south of Africa, this is where Homo naledi was found, which is one of the most recent new kind of hominid species that was found. It's between 250,000 and 320,000 years old. And in the cave system, you can see the person here crawling. It's incredibly difficult to get through certain passages, but very deep within this kind of, I think it's about 10 kilometers long, this cave system. There's a number of burials. So there's a number of kind of these tiny little places, literally where like you would have to lift up the bones and throw them over kind of a barrier, where there's been multiple burials, where there's upwards of 10 or 12 or 15 bodies that have been found in one place. And so I think it basically says that the nature of burying is something that goes back very far in time. But it's not just, I'm not showing this just to kind of note that humans had a sense of a kind of afterlife early on, and that we had it even before we were in our modern form. But to go back to this idea of smoke, if it is what it does, then if the corpse or the dead body it is like, in a way, like smoke, in that it makes a connection between the living and the dead. And one curiosity I have is if burying in one place, if piling up in one place increases the intensity of that place to be able to become a place where the dead and the living come together. So as I said, metaphor does what it is and is what it does. Yunkaporta also kind of describes how these rituals with metaphor worked. What he says is what made these rituals effective is not simply the cultural content of the dances. It was the dreaming action of translating a real life event into metaphor, then manipulating the metaphor to gain understanding, followed by innovation transferred back to the real world. And I think going back to caves is one place where we can see this around the world. In the late 1980s, David Lewis Williams, a professor from the University of Cape Town, analyzed a lot of the geometric figures that were found in cave paintings around the world, and made the argument that what they looked like was entoptic phenomena. So basically, when one goes into a different state of consciousness, whether it's through a trance dance or through chemicals or whatnot, there's certain patterns that appear before your eyes before you get into a kind of full change of consciousness. And Nick, are you telling me to stop, or are you waving at someone?
I'm waving to Marina.
Hi, Marina. Let me check the time. Okay, not so bad. Right, so entoptic phenomenon. So he was basically finding that his argument was that what we were finding in caves was actually like dream journals. It was people that were going on trips and they were drawing what they were seeing and trying to make sense of it. And as we've already seen from practices, whether it was Tolkien and Jung or it's the Shipibo textile weavers, this practice actually creates a flywheel effect. It narrows the distance between the living and the dead, or the living and something else, and it increases the contact, it increases the intensity of the feedback and the ability to have actual communication. And why I think that's kind of interesting is in 2013, I think it was, the paleo ontologist Genevieve von Petzinger did the first ever comprehensive study of all of the caves in France and Spain, and I think in Britain as well, where she looked at over 350 caves, and she chronicled not the beautiful pictures of animals and so on, but again, the kind of geometric shapes, and found that there was only 32 that were over a course of more than 30 years, and 70% of them were already there at the very beginning. And her argument is what we're looking at in these caves is, and potentially this is the kind of like enlivening of these entoptic phenomena, is applying meaning to these things, that these shapes actually started to have meaning and became a kind of proto-language. Other researchers extended her work after that and found that you could actually find these exact same shapes all over the world, all the way down to Australia, and a large subset of the same shapes. Igor Reznikov, who's a professor of paleoacoustics in Paris, he also found that there was a relationship, a correlation between the density of paintings you could find in caves and the intensity of the resonant frequencies in those areas. So basically the place in the cave where you could, if singing or humming or creating some sort of reverberation of sound, could potentially put you into a different, a trance state or a different state of consciousness, that's where you find all of the paintings. And so I think it lends credence to this idea of that the cave was a kind of place for dream journaling. And then you also see it much later in ancient Greek culture, particularly with things like the Oracle of Delphi, where these, a lot of these kind of oracular cults themselves started within caves. And only later kind of emerged outwards and had their own shrines and temples and so on outside of the cave. And well, I'm not going to read this whole quote, but in recent work by Yulia Ustinova, she describes just how common these experiences were for almost everyday Greeks, that a lot of people went through this process of incubation in a cave. And so having the experience of the cave, having the experience of an altered state of consciousness, and as she says here, near-death experiences were one of those kind of reported instances of kind of locking yourself in a cave like a Tibetan monk for a long period of time. Basically, the cave was a place to communicate with something on the other side of the veil, but also have a taste of what death felt like. And that's why I think it's kind of relevant here. So going back to the slogans, and again, I think you can when you go back and read Plato's allegory of the cave, for me, it makes a lot more sense now in this context, right? Like the idea of you're trapped in a cave, you're watching shadows on the wall, but if you can transcend the cave and get outside and see the real forms, the real ideas, the truly kind of Platonic nature of the universe, it's not just that you trip and you get to see it. The role of the dialectic, according to Plato, was that you had to come back and convince the others. And so again, it's this idea of completing the loop that Yonka Porta was saying. And I think, and you do that, and by doing that, you're creating magic. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted Mitch on the call, and we'll talk about this later maybe. I think this is maybe one way of thinking about what magic even is being able to kind of go out into a space of metaphor, manipulate the metaphor, and then bring that knowledge back to change the world. And I think on the converse, you could also say that the marriage metaphor itself is magical. The oracle at Delphi was not just huffing a kind of methane leak from the ground. The ritual process was actually to go into a ritual marriage with Apollo in order to kind of have Apollo speak through her, to be possessed by Apollo and allow spirit to speak through the living to the rest of the living. And I think, and this is where I'll kind of pivot now to what I think this can mean for thinking about architecture. So back to Yonka Porta, now he's talking about place. He says, story places or sacred sites are places of overlap between the two worlds, which is why people need protection when entering these places, calling out for the old people and putting armpit sweat or smoke or water on those who are entering. An example of that I think you can see in Native North American burial practices. And this is showing here in the mid-19th century, what it looked like to excavate these burial mounds. There was mounds everywhere all over North America. Literally it was littered with them, and a number of them had different layers of burials within them. So these are literally, again, taking corpses, human bodies, metaphors for connecting between the living and the dead, and piling them up and turning them in, and creating sacred place and site out of them. An example of that is the Serpent Mound in Ohio. And I think what's interesting about this is it's been in recent years, a lot more research has gone into looking at whether or not there was more sophistication to these mounds than just piling up dirt. And one of the ways that there might have been is a kind of astronomical understanding that's built into the shape of these mounds. And as you can see here, potentially connecting to equinox and solstice, sun and moon and so on. And you also see it in a number of these other, sorry, I'm trying to speed up now, so I'm like mumbling my words. You see it in a number of these kind of mounds all over the United States, or what's now the United States, Mexico and Canada, well, not, yeah, just the United States and Mexico. And then also even further down, I think you could, with kind of deforestation of the Amazon now, you're starting to see very similar kind of geoglyphs that are emerging, that have been sitting there dormant and latent for most hundreds, if not thousands of years, that have yet to even be cataloged, let alone kind of excavated or unearthed or understood or analyzed for what kind of intelligence they might hold. Where people have been spending a long time analyzing is with the megalithic stones in the British Isles and northern France. And in particular, Stonehenge, which is obviously captured a lot of attention over the years. And while there's a number of theories about what this might be, and of course the stones can't speak for themselves, so it's effectively all conjecture, there are some things that are fairly, they're basically a kind of consensus amongst scholars and researchers. In particular, the kind of blue rectangle that encapsulates the main inner circle, it aligns with summer solstices and also the most northerly moon set. So basically it's looking at it's connecting in a single shape on the ground, the rhythms of the sun and the moon together and marrying them together into a single shape. And what's interesting about that is it's also scaled. So it creates this rectangle creates a 5-12-13, a 5-12 rectangle, which if you cut it in half, makes a 5-12-13 Pythagorean triangle. And Robin Heath, about 10 or 15 years ago, I think, showed that with this triangle, it actually, the triangle itself marries the sun and the moon. Because if you, let me, so I can't use my mouse to show anything, but if you basically hammer 3 pegs into the ground that are 5, 12, and 13, whatever dimension apart, and you wrap a rope around them, if you take point A, stretch it to point C, and then move it to point D, which is 2/5 of the way along point 5, the length of it is 12.369, which is exactly the number of lunar months in the year. So whether or not this is actually happening, I don't think it matters. Or rather, whether or not the people who made this were aware of it, I don't think matters. I think what's interesting for me is that in a rectangle that's meant to marry sun and moon, the dimensions of it marry sun and moon in yet another way. And it also so happens that that same 5, 12, 13 triangle, when scaled up, connects Stonehenge with the Bluestone site 126 or so miles away, where the stones themselves were dug up and dragged from, and also Lundy Island, which is another stone circle with the same dimensions. In the, looking at the time, okay. In the mid 20th century, Alexander Thom, who was a professor of engineering at Cambridge, spent about 50 years going around for all of his summer vacations to every stone circle he could get to in the British Isles and in northern France, and basically brought his survey equipment and surveyed every single stone as best as he could. And in 1974, he wrote a book called Megalithic Sites in Britain, where he took that 50 years of analysis and applied a statistical analysis to it, to each of the different types of stone circles, and basically deduced that there was a unit of measure that was common amongst all of them, which is what he called the megalithic yard, which is 2.72 feet, almost with a high degree of precision everywhere he went. This has been challenged because the question was, how could, over so many years, so much space, so much time, how could a people have come up with a unit of measure that was so precise that would be used in so many different places? And so, of course, it was kind of laughed at, ridiculed, and totally thrown out because, as we all know, people a long time ago were not sophisticated. They didn't know how to count. And so his research was ridiculed. More recently, it was picked up and it was kept very active in groups really outside of kind of mainstream academia. One of them was Christopher Knight and his partner, I forget his name, who started studying the henges around England and found that the megalithic yard could also be used to describe the shape and size of these henges. And from that, they deduced a way that they thought you could actually get to a uniform megalithic yard without having to carry like a meter stick around that might get battered and abused and destroyed and shift and change over time. And the way to do that is to basically build a henge where you can create an artificial horizon. So you can see the stars rising and setting over a kind of straight line. And then in that circle, you divide the circle into 366 equidistant points. 366 is the number of times in a year the number of days it takes for a star in a year to go back and rise from the place where it's set from. So it's a kind of stellar year rather than a solar year. And then what you do is you stand at the center and you take a pendulum and you swing it, and you count how long it takes something moving in the sky, a star, a planet, to move from one pole to the next. So it's basically moving 1/366 of a way across the sky. And when you swing it, if you count 366 times, double the length of the pendulum will be exactly 1 megalithic yard. And this has to do with the kind of dynamics of pendulums and the fact that it doesn't matter how hard you swing it because it'll basically take the same amount of time to go back and forth. So a pendulum can basically be used as a stopwatch. And that's how they're arguing that it was used to come up with the megalithic yard. And this is Christopher Knight. I'm going to play a short video of him speaking at a bookstore a few years ago where he talks about the experience that he had at one of these sites.
There was a fanned array of stones, only so big, and they had been heated to their Curie temperature, which is not unusual in the megalithic period, which means that the diapoles were aligned. That is, they laid the stones in line with Earth's magnetic field, and all the random polarity inside the quartz became aligned, and it set up a standing force field. And as myself and my colleague moved between the rows, which were only a small distance apart, our mobile phones went from full signal to zero, full to zero, full to zero. They were still operating. And I agreed to stand in the focal point of all these. My friend, who's a PhD in electronics, said, "Don't do that." And I said, "Oh, come on, you know, what's going to happen?" So I went and stood there. Bright blue light, absolute brightest blue light I've ever seen, within seconds. And then this rushing feeling around my face like water. And I couldn't think of anything apart from staring into this blue light. And apparently I stood there for about 10 minutes or so before I slowly walked away. My colleague had been shouting to me. He thought I was messing about, but I wasn't. And as I walked away, my head was feeling like a Belisha beacon. And that continued for 3 days. And during those 3 days, I was 100% psychic. I'm glad it went away.
In case the video cut you in here, he said I was 100% psychic. It so happens that it seems that this technology, whether it's baked into the universe or it was understood by humans, seems to be somewhat more universal than just England. If you create a 360-degree circle and you swing your pendulum 240 times, you end up with a meter, or just under a meter, which was actually the Sumerian step. And it was the Sumerians that gave us the 360-degree circle and the 24-hour day. What's interesting about this, again, I'm not trying to say that it's necessarily true or it's how they built the pyramids or the stone circles or anything else, but it's an interesting cipher that allows us to get excited about thinking about what these ancient monuments might have been doing and the technology they might have had. Because I've already shown, I think, I've tried to show the sophistication that the sophistication of indigenous cultures around the world, the sophistication they have for dealing with metaphor and with spirit, that they've developed over thousands of years. And I think you have to, you have to realize that the people that built the monuments that still exist, whether they be megalithic monuments, are coming out of cultures that were doing similar things for thousands of years. And so I think it's a useful and an interesting cipher to try to understand what was going on. Going back to pendulums then, pendulum depends on gravity, which actually you can see on the weird kind of ball on the right. Gravity is not uniform around the Earth's surface, so pendulum will swing faster or slower depending where you are, and also the height you are from the surface of the Earth. So every location then actually has something unique and specific about it if you were to use a technology like a pendulum to try to figure out a way of binding space and time and structure and form together. The other thing that's interesting about the Earth is that it's squashed. So if you take the same, if you look at a kind of polar section of the Earth, if you look at the meridian, it's actually not a perfect circle. The arc length, if you take the same angle, the arc length at the pole is actually less than the arc length at the equator, because the Earth is it's a spheroid, it's not a perfect sphere. And so this is showing here just a 1 degree kind of arc between 37 and 38 degrees on the meridian, which actually aligns with basically where the Parthenon is in Greece. If you look at that kind of angular dimension of the Earth, that geodetic dimension, 1 degree of that, if you basically scale that down to basically 1 second of arc of that, it turns out that 1 second of meridian arc at exactly the latitude of the Parthenon works out to exactly 100 Greek feet. And so basically what I'm trying to show is, what I'm sharing is that when we dig up architecture around the world, there was this, when we started digging up architecture in the West, there was a dilemma in the 17th century or so, because they thought that this the Renaissance basically said this architecture was perfect, and we need to copy it. And then they started digging it up and they started measuring it, and they realized that everything was different. There was a whole bunch of different types of measurements. And as a result, there was this kind of trauma of the ancients weren't perfect. And there was a number of different kind of stories that were kind of woven to figure out how to account for the fact that these weren't, that these dimensions were all kind of different. And probably the most famous one is Claude Perrault, who said, well, we'll take the average, which was the kind of modern thing to do. And taking the average is a problem because if dimensions are actually a function of place, then you are universalizing dimensions, and the Earth isn't universal. It's not round, it's not spherical. It has character to the place where it is. And more there's evidence of different dimensions being used in different places, but seemingly kind of extracted from universal principles, like taking the arc length at the of the meridian at the latitude. Going down to Egypt then, the Great Pyramid in Giza is actually built on top of a plateau, a short kind of plinth, and that plinth is a little bit offset from the pyramid. And one thing that's been noticed is that the pyramid itself, the perimeter of the pyramid itself, equates to half of an arc length of the equatorial reach. Whereas the outside of the larger plinth actually equates to the half length meridian arc. This is hard to say, sorry. Basically what's encoded is the fact that the Earth at the equator is a circle, but along the meridian vertically, it's not. And so it's an oval. And so you can't, the 1 minute of meridian arc is not the same as 1 minute of equatorial arc. And the Great Pyramid seems to encode for that difference. The other thing it does is if you make a trommel wheel, which is, you know, the thing that the little druid is holding on the left, which is for kind of marking out lengths as you kind of, as it clicks by, every time it rotates, it'll count out one circumference. If you make a trommel wheel that's 1 megalithic yard in circumference, it's also exactly 1 royal cubit in diameter. And the Great Pyramid, the shape of the Great Pyramid is such that the perimeter is exactly 279 megalithic yards, or 279 trommel wheel rotations around, and it's 279 trommel wheels high, or 279 royal cubits. So there's been much made, there's been many, like, people will take this information and spawn vast stories and vast conspiracies about what this means. I think it's much simpler than that. I think that there's something basic about marrying together dimensions of the Earth into architecture that transforms it not into a model of the Earth, because nobody would say a triangle looks like the Earth, but rather a metaphor of the Earth. I'm going to skip over this. And doing that, going back to what Christopher Knight was claiming that he experienced when he was 100% psychic, walking into this, this kind of force field at the center of a megalithic stone circle. When in the 1790s, when Napoleon conquered Egypt, he basically carved out a night for himself to spend a night inside the Great Pyramid. I mean, this is a kind of apocryphal story, but apocryphally, what he said when he got out, the next day, one of his deputies said, you know, how was it? And his answer was, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. And why I think that's, you know, not just purely apocryphal is because the same thing happened to Aleister Crowley in the early 20th century, where he spent a couple nights inside the Great Pyramid sleeping where the pharaohs might have been, and was basically downloaded one of the most influential occult books of the 20th century. And not just an occult book, but a book that, and a person who went on to like strongly influence everything from international espionage to Jimi Hendrix and popular culture. So that's, yeah, the power of measured metaphor. Okay, back to Yom Kippur for 2 more, and then I'm done. Okay, so he says, through meaning making, we effectively store information outside our brains and objects, places, and relationships with others. This is how spirit works. If you use a familiar object to help you encode new knowledge that you're learning, then when you pick up that object or even just visualize it, you instantly remember what you learned. It has become a tangible metaphor, an overlap between the two worlds. And so that's I think what might be happening with this architecture is it's by becoming a tangible metaphor, it's becoming an overlap between the two worlds. And that's why someone like Aleister Crowley might have been able to speak to what he thought was an entity that was an Egyptian god that was funneling through him a new book. One of the last examples I'm going to show is actually the first ever pyramid. So this is the step pyramid at Saqqara, in which it was shown not so long ago that this is the pyramid as it would have been originally inside of its very ornate, super precise enclosure of like, I think it's a 12-meter tall wall. And each of those niches, that kind of crenellation along the wall, if you count it, you find that on the top and bottom, you get numbers. Again, this is that 366, so the kind of stellar year. So you get something about encoding the idea of time. And then along the west wall, you get 461. And on the east wall, you get 1458 or 59, depending on how you count one of the doors. And what Robert Bauval and Thomas Brophy pointed out a couple of years ago in a book is that so the Egyptian calendar was such that they knew there was 365.25 or so days in a year, but instead they kept a 365-day calendar, and every day let basically the first day of the year slip by a little bit. And what that meant was every 1461 years, they had to, they basically kind of completely reset. And if you do the math precisely, or sorry, if you do the math at 365.25 days in a year, you get to 1461. So the idealized number of what they called their Sothic cycle was 1461. But in practice, it actually works out to 1458 and a half. And so the argument here by these researchers that pointed this out was in the walls of this enclosure, you have this sort of marriage of the ideal and the real. And that was also what we saw with the pyramid. And then also, the other thing that happens here is when Sirius, the star Sirius, which was one of the most influential stars of the ancient world because it's the brightest star in the sky, when it was at the meridian, so directly above, if you stood on the north altar and looked at the pyramid, directly on top of the pyramid would be the star of Sirius. So it's a way of kind of encoding information in a abstract, almost mathematical way about time, and then another shape to encode it with the mythology that's baked into the stars. This was done through a ritual called the stretching of the cord, which you can see here. And to understand that, how am I for time? I've only got a couple more minutes, so I think I'm okay. To understand that the stretching, I want to like elementary school, planetary cosmology. So if this is the kind of planets rotate around it in the ecliptic in a kind of flat plane, they're not just all over the place. And that's what allows us to have something like the zodiac, because when you look out from the Earth and you see planets or the sun, it'll always be in front of one of 12 of these kind of other signs on this kind of band that runs around in plane with the ecliptic. The Earth itself, though, doesn't rotate. When it spins on its axis, it spins on an axis about 23.5 degrees off of that ecliptic. And as a result, what that means is when you look up in the sky, depending on where you are, if you look north, you'll see that the sky, as the stars rotate over time, if you took a time-lapse photography like this one, you'll see that basically all the stars in the sky are kind of moving from east to west, except for the pole stars in the south and the very north. At this moment in time, we actually have a star that's precisely there, which is the star Polaris, which you see here in the center of the frame. And to the Egyptians, anything that was always above the horizon, any star that was kind of close enough to the North Pole of the sky, was what was called the imperishable, because they never died. These were stars that never went to sleep. They never set over the horizon. They were always up. They just became invisible when the sun came up, but they were always there. Another aspect that's important to understand is that by spinning on its axis, the Earth bulges, and that's why you have a circular equator, but a kind of a non-circular meridian. And what that does is it causes the Earth, when it's spinning, to kind of wobble. And what that wobble does is it causes the axis of the Earth to slowly jiggle around another axis on about a 26,000 year cycle that's known as the precession of the equinoxes. So basically the relationship between the Earth and the heavens is changing periodically on a 26,000 year cycle. And so those stars that are actually the imperishable ones, the ones that are close enough to the North Pole, are always changing. They're changing over time. So today we've got Polaris in the center. But if we look at another constellation or an asterism like the Big Dipper, which has Alcate at the kind of tip of the handle and Dubhe at the end of the kind of basin, if you add a horizon to that at a particular place in a particular time, only everything that is kind of inside the red circle there is going to be above the horizon at all times. So part of the Big Dipper in this case is an imperishable star, but the rest of it actually goes to sleep at night and then rises again during the day. So if this asterism was important to you mythologically, or if it allowed you to discern something about your environment that was important for survival, it might be interesting or useful to know when and where that star system was rising. But then over time, because of precession, it's actually going to start changing. So where that is in relation to the sky, if you started to mark it on the ground, say where those stars were rising at certain times, then your markers would be kind of off by about 1 degree every 72 years. But you would end up with new stars that were entering the zone of the imperishables. What I want to show here is just that it was actually in the Egyptian desert about 7,000 years ago that the Big Dipper finally moved, or not 7,000 years ago, 7,000 BC, that the Big Dipper finally moved entirely into the realm, into the area of the imperishable. So that even the lowest star was kind of always visible. And the moment that it did that was also a time when Sirius was rising on the horizon at exactly the moment that the rains would come to bring water to the desert for the nomadic peoples that were herding their cattle there. Sorry, I'm like bumbling my words here. I apologize for this. Trying to figure out how to say this quickly without getting too much into the mathematics and the dorky stuff. But basically there's a stone circle in the desert in Egypt, in the southwest of Egypt, about 100 kilometers outside of the Nile, that encodes, that's been shown in the late 90s, to encode this information of the Big Dipper in particular, circling, and the moments in time that it would align or rise in the sky at sunrise with Sirius. And when that happened was basically when the monsoon rains came, and which was precisely when these nomadic people would head into the desert in order to be able to feed their cattle before they migrated back to other parts of Northern Africa. This same idea, I think, it's an archaic idea that's kind of, you can see it littered throughout megalithic architecture through the 3,000 years of dynastic Egypt. And where it's maybe most apparent is in the oldest known comprehensive map of the stars, which is the zodiac at Dendera, which was made about 50 BC, I believe, or it's dated to about 50 BC. And in the center of it, you see the same, there we go. This asterism is central, which is the Big Dipper, which was thought of by the Egyptians to be the thigh of a bull. And it was also kind of confounded with the adze, which was the kind of main tool used by craftsmen. Was those two things, the bull's thigh and the adze, were sort of brought together in one of the most important rituals in Egyptian culture, which was the opet re, or the opening of the mouth, which was performed on statues. It was performed on pharaohs when they died. And the concept was basically, it was a way to allow the pharaoh to be reborn into the afterlife. And it did so by both slaughtering a bull and taking its right foreleg and presenting that right foreleg to the statue of the pharaoh, and then taking the aids and also touching this to the mouth of the pharaoh to open the mouth so that it would open the mouth of the pharaoh in the afterlife. And the other thing that's interesting is the sky was thought of as made of iron, because the only iron that was known at this time was iron that came in the form of meteorites. And so actually what's shown here is that in King Tutankhamun's tomb is found daggers and other materials that were made out of meteoric iron. And so it's been said that it was meteoric iron that was tapped to the sculpture's mouth to be able to open the mouth in the afterlife. And this is just showing one tomb where you actually see almost the entire opening of the mouth ritual played out, and in particular the sacrificial aspect. The reason I'm showing this is in a recent text by Aaron Cheek, who's a kind of scholar of the occult and of alchemy, talking about this Opet Ray ritual. He says, all materia magica employed in theurgic and magical praxis must be seen to partake in an identical procedure. The act of creating gods, or rather material vehicles for divine forces, such as statues and talismans. The art also extended to the reanimation of the dead. In other words, this is a ritual pattern that was used for reanimation, that was used for birthing into the afterlife, but it's also a universal one that can be found elsewhere. And the example that he gives for that is in the Greek magical papyri, which were written in the, I think the 2nd to the 4th century. But basically there's sort of, the concept that he brings to it is that the Greek magical papyri, which are basically the kind of the notes of a temple priest that was also working as a kind of sorcerer for hire. And in it, he singles out a particular ritual, which is the Ufor ritual, which was for consecrating a ring. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I want to wrap this up. But basically what's interesting about it is you see all the different things that were brought together, all the kind of like layers of sophistication in terms of the material symbol, how you pronounce things, the state of purity that one has to be in when doing this, the words that one pronounces, and the idea that how you move spirit literally into matter and orchestrate it, the sounds you have to make, the timing, the smoke, the sacrifice, the orientation, all kind of orchestrated into a ritual that seems to have origins that goes back literally thousands of years, but gets refined over time to the point that you can fit it onto a gemstone on a ring. And as it says here in the Greek magical papyrus at the end, you have to hide this, magician, keep this a secret, because this contains the truth in summary. This is the sort of ritual. And I did a kind of shitty job of this, but I was trying to show how this relates, I think, to the stretching of the cord ceremony and how they're all part of the same kind of metaphysics. Yeah. So the punchline at the end of it is this idea that tombs are wombs, that there's a kind of symmetry between the living and the dead, and that the tomb is not just a kind of, the tomb being a sophisticated architectural metaphor for manipulating the spirit of one who was once alive, is not just a place to go and die, but it's also a place to be reborn. And there are technologies from many cultures, Egyptians are only one of them, for doing this, for sending the dead off correctly. And as such, I think there's also, we could also, in the case that we're dealing with, a memorial for the dead who were killed en masse in a horrendous way and then shoveled under the ground. What I'm curious about is what are the practices by which you can do this kind of retroactively? What are the ways that you can treat the dead properly and give them the proper burial 50, 70, 80 years later when they weren't effectively disposed of properly? And what do you need to avoid? Here's the last thing I'm going to quote from Yonka Porta, where he kind of talks about the stakes. So he says, it's a metaphor based on deception. And in an Aboriginal worldview, this is how curses work. You take part of a system, for example, a person's hair, and observe the pattern of the whole system, for example, his body or his or her body, mind, and spirit, in that fragment. Then you sing a false pattern, for example, you are dying, into the whole from the part, powering it with another system in constant motion, for example, running water. The curse is a deception made real, either an outright lie or a true law or pattern applied where it doesn't belong. It's like a computer virus, a sneaky line of code that ends up crashing the whole system. And so I think I'm going to skip over this part. I'll talk about Wittkover later, but basically the punchline was, let's be smart and let's not accidentally curse. And so these were the kind of, just a kind of summary of the 9 points that I tried to go through. And this is all kind of, I've shared this with the rest of the group before, but this is the idea that I'm trying to share here and start a conversation around is a series of probably 5 workshops that I want to convene for this group publicly, where we would bring in different people that would have expertise in different ways of dealing with the dead, burial practices being one of them, to come up with a series of principles and educate ourselves and try to think through how one deals with the specific location of Babin Yar, the specific history of Babin Yar, the specific history of the specific culture of Judaism and its practices and so on. And I'll stop there. Thank you for your patience.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Troy.
Sorry, that went really long.
No, it was beautiful. Thank you. It's compelling.
Yeah, so I mean, let's move into a discussion. I mean, I think that there's really quite a lot to discuss. But I mean, yeah, thank you, Troy, for this. It was quite a whirlwind. Also like a kind of a crash course into these other ways of kind of understanding meaning in kind of form making and material. But I don't know. I mean, how would you like to do this? Maybe, I mean, as Mitch is kind of your invited guest, maybe we should give the floor to you, Mitch, to give kind of a preliminary response, and then we can continue the discussion.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you. Just sort of an adjacent observation that I wanted to make. Here in the United States, at this moment, funerary architecture is very much on the decline, and it's very interesting because it's only been the past maybe 2 years or so that, in fact, cremations have surpassed burial as the funerary election of choice among the public. Right at this moment, about just above 50% of American interments are cremations. And this is really very new because cremation was not practiced in the United States at all, really, until the late 1870s. And when cremation was introduced into the modern US, it was here in New York City in 1876, although the actual incineration was carried out in Pennsylvania. The ceremony was done here in the US, and then the incineration was carried out in Pennsylvania. There were members of the Theosophical Society, the occult organization from the late 19th century, that decided it would be a good instigation, and they liked provoking and instigating, to introduce in their own way what was then considered this exotic, pagan, Eastern-oriented funerary rite into the modern world. And the reaction to the Theosophical Society announcing this cremation in 1876 was a near riot outside the Masonic Hall where they had the ceremony. And newspapers and other folk who commented on it at the time sounded a lot like Lowe's did, not quite a generation later, talking about tattoos as this reemergence of primitive rites and something that he viewed with alarm. People felt here in New York and other parts of the nation, that the reintroduction, the introduction of cremation into modern American life was this retrograde step, back into the mists of antiquity, or the importation of Vedic practices that were pagan and that were anti-Christian. And the Theosophical Society, of course, reveled in all this because they liked to court controversy. And they also discovered that it's really very tough to incinerate a body. These bodies we occupy are very resilient, and it takes a lot to reduce one to ashes. And so one of the co-founders of the Theosophical Society had to haul around a corpse with him for several weeks until he found he didn't plan ahead very well, until he found an incinerator in Pennsylvania that was powerful enough to burn the body, which happened several weeks after the initial ceremony. So anyway, what I'm really saying is, it just wasn't very long ago that cremation wasn't even heard of here in the United States. And today, more than 50% of funerary choices are cremation. And so, and that bar is rising. The folks who perform cremations, like everybody else, they have a lobbying group, and they track these things, very carefully. They want people to be cremated, and so crematoria are busier than ever here in America, and this bar is going up, 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 and it's been going up for about it's been going up for decades, but it's experienced a real precipitous rise and passed the 50% mark over the past 10 years or so. So it's funny, as a popular choice, headstones and mausoleums and modern crypts or vaults, they're being used less and less. So you're constructing a monument at a time where here in the United States, at least, such monuments on a practical level, on an individual level, are on the decline. And it's just an interesting kind of adjacent note that I wanted to put into the mix. If current trends continue in the US, headstones and vaults and mausoleums really going to become the exception. They'll maybe not rarefied, but within the minority. So you're doing this at an interesting moment in history, at least apropos of what's going on in the US around popular burial practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that came out quite strongly, I think, Troy, in your presentation, this idea of, or this kind of, this feeling of kind of a lost knowledge, right? Or a lost past, a lost tradition. And I think that's also something that is, so, you ended with this question of like, how do you retroactively do something? But yeah, I think, I just kind of as a comment, there's something very Eisenmanian to your presentation, right? Of just this like relentless layering of meaning on top of objects. And so I think what you have shown us here is almost like you've almost like set a bar, in my opinion, of like how much meaning an object should have, and how much meaning is essential to creating a space that can create that can act as a common space for the living and the dead. But yeah, then this question really is of like, what happens when you don't have that? When those practices are not actively being practiced.
Yeah, well, so then, it begs a question, which is it appropriate for us to have that ambition, or are we overstepping our bounds in a way, right? Like if you, because like the idea of taking accountability for, if you actually believe that burial is very important, like if you first of all, if you believe in an afterlife of some sort, and then if you believe that burial is important for ensuring some sort of success in that afterlife, and then you see a situation like this where you feel like, okay, these are mass graves, this was mass murder, it almost takes a high level of hubris to think that you can operate at that level. But at the same time, so I guess like the question I would have is like who feels squeamish about this? Tell me more, Robert Young, because you've done this before. You've had these conversations for years, and I'm wondering, like, also I'm not Jewish, so I'm not even sure if this is appropriate for the culture that we're attempting to memorialize.
Okay, I had raised my hand. I was imagining, almost any Orthodox Jew listening to this, and they would have walked away, 45 minutes ago. But this is not the last thing I'm going to say about it. There is, I think, a bridge. But let's first of all look at the broad outline of Jewish religion, of basically the Jewish view of the world is exactly opposite to what you basically have described today. In some way, it's a great revolt against this idea of nature, the unity of the cosmos. The Jewish view has been very much about the dichotomy. It celebrates God as the creator, the single creator. It creates a clear distance between God and nature. So it is not the idea that the divine is embodied within within creation itself is denied by Judaism. And so, in a sense, what you are arguing, or the world that you're describing, would be a world that would be profoundly alien to most, I would say, Jewish denominations, at least at I would say, at a theoretical level. Now, theory and practice, of course, are not always the same, and that's where there might be a crack. But I would say that for the people who were murdered, for the Jews who were murdered in Babin Yar, most of the things that you are you're mentioning would seem profoundly alien, and so to superimpose such kind of ideas on their quote unquote afterlife, I think would be problematic. Now, and I could go on for hours on this, and I'm not going to do that, but in some way my talk itself showed very clearly that development in a completely different direction. There is, however, an interesting, I don't want to say call it practice or a tradition, but if you actually look at Jewish cemeteries, and the most famous one is the Prague Cemetery, which is in the center of Prague. Under conditions of ghetto life, in which Jews had no space, basically, in which, and the only space that was quite often, the only place that was quite often owned by a Jewish community and that could be owned by Jews was a cemetery. You get a very interesting condition that, first of all, the cemetery cannot be enlarged, but exhumations cannot take place in the cemetery. That goes against Jewish practice, which means that these places get crowded and crowded and crowded and crowded with more and more and more corpses. So typically in a Christian cemetery, what happens is, you body a corpse, and, after 10, 15, 20 years, you can exhume the corpse to make place for another corpse. In the family grave, there's a recycling quite often. The bones in the Catholic tradition, especially around the Mediterranean, the bones will all be collected then in some kind of ossuary, or whatever like that. But but in some way in the Christian cemetery, there is a recycling in some way of the bodies through the cemetery. This doesn't take place in the Jewish cemeteries, which means that at a certain moment, despite all of the, let's say, ideological kind of context that creates an absolute separation between the spirit and nature, that means between the human spirit and nature, or between human life and spirit nature. Human life is only seen in terms of history and never in its relationship to nature itself. Practically, what you get in the Jewish cemeteries is in fact the exact opposite starts to happen. That is that there is a complete, that when you come in a Jewish cemetery, you come in a world where you showed that big painting of the jungle. You know, I mean, at that moment, relatively early on in your piece, at that moment, I'm thinking, I'm actually looking at the colored version of the typical East European Jewish cemetery. That there's a density, the ground is moving, everything is intertwined, the trees, whatever grows, grass, the bodies, the tombstones. It seems to be as all distinctions actually disappear. And this is one of the reasons that the Prague cemetery in the tradition, in the anti-Semitic tradition, has become central to the anti-Semitic imagination. That is starting with the novel Biarritz by a guy called Goethe in the 1860s, and that goes then to the whole tradition of the elders of Zion, which is this idea of these meetings of these elders, this great conspiracy of Jews. Always it's set in the Prague cemetery, because the idea of the Jewish conspiracy is exactly that, in which nature and history start to merge into a single piece. Elizabeth, I think you're showing a picture. So you're still muted, but I guess that this is the cemetery. So if I were to, I mean, I can take two roads, two responses to your presentation. The first one I say is that if you get a rabbi in, or if you get, any Jewish philosopher coming in who comes from the straightforward tradition, basically you're going to be slapped, on your face. It's going to bang, 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 out, naughty boy. You don't understand everything. However, if you were to try to approach this through actually I would say the historical tradition of the East European Jewish cemetery, you actually might have a point. You might have a point of context, and of course, this is one of the refrains that I think I haven't told it to the whole group, but certainly to Nick. For me, the key piece in the whole site that we have at Babin Yar is actually not a ravine with the ravine where the mass graves were, where the people were murdered and where ultimately the exhumations took place and so on. The key is actually that we're on the edge of an old Jewish cemetery. Yeah? And that for me is where in some way the interest in this whole exercise lies. How can you connect in some way the catastrophe and the site of catastrophe to the tradition of Jewish burial, which in fact is kind of, in the way it is done, negates its own ideology. Yeah, because of the conditions of exile. So that would be my first, my first kind of take on your presentation. I must say that I studied at the Warburg Institute. Frances Yates was my mentor. She died before my dissertation was finished, but I did it on memory cultures. And of course, at the Warburg Institute, Aleister Crowley's papers are there. And there was always this bifurcation at the Warburg. You had the people who came there for Aleister Crowley's, to see Aleister Crowley's papers, and they were the weird lot. And then you had the official people that was just basically Gombrich, Frances Yates, and so on. And I certainly belonged to that side of the divide. And there was very little reaching over the aisle to what we called the believers. In some way, when I went to work with Frances Yates, I had to sit through an examination. I was interrogated by a panel of Warburg profs. And the only thing they really wanted me to prove is I didn't believe in the stuff. And then I was allowed to study it. So that's the corner of the world I come from.
Thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. I missed last maybe 10 minutes, yes, something like that, because I went to the conversation with Manuel Hert. We have like everyday conversation at the same time, just to keep going our crazy idea to build the synagogue in 2 months. But it was, for me, it was very, and it is very inspiring presentation. And me personally, I'm believers in everything. I believe in pure scientific knowledge, and I also believe in everything what Troy present to us. And I think in the project, like our project, is unique possibility to represent all possible visions. Of course, it's a question where precise and what kind of part of the story we're telling. Of course, when we're talking about Jewish story, about Holocaust story, and it's most important part of the museum. Of course, here we should based in and I agree with Robert Jan, we should based on Jewish cemetery, on all the story of different but very clear Jewish traditions. But if you will have like more wide shot, then, or if you can have a look on the site, for example, in direction of psychiatric hospital, which is quite far from the place where the Jews was killed, but at the same time also part of Babin Yar complex, because it was the first. It was a place where the first was killed 752 patients of the psychiatric hospital. Or if you go to the ravine, for example, today I walk there almost, and it was quite dark. Yesterday I did when it was not so dark, but it doesn't matter it's dark or not. You have very special physiological feeling there. Not only me, not because I'm so sensitive. It's most of the people, because we ask them, they have a kind of feeling there is something happened there. And we can see how the people walk around and they just, people like animals, they just never go to some of the places, which look beautiful, everything is fine there, but they just going around. And it's very interesting fact and feeling. And I think it's not, for me, it's not about direct association or direct things that we should do like Amazonian tribes did. But I think the understanding of the world, if we will just compare everything, if we will just look from the side, it give the possibility to feel and to go also through very different traditions. And if we can imagine that people came from South America, for example, for them to go through something what they can recognize is also the way how they can reach the point. And this multi-accessible body of the future space, I think it's very important, and it's very interesting to discuss the structure, because in the presentation also it's very, first of all, it's a very beautiful presentation how it's done. Thank you so much. But it's also very interesting and very inspiring structure. Bless you. Thank you.
I maybe have a comment, because I think I'm still thinking about everything that Troy you put on the table. It was super fascinating. And you know that I love to listen to all your findings. I'm totally a fan. I was thinking, imagining, if we imagine that somehow the architecture or the intervention that is going to be done in the space has such a meaning, then what is that we are trying to do with that, with a more elevated meaning that connects with forces? Because to me, there is, the question is that what happened in that site is this type of horror and banality of murder, that in a way, how do you relate that to something at a type of architecture that has a more elevated meaning? In a way, you want to celebrate the lives of the people who were murdered there, but at the same time, how you don't celebrate actually the act of murdering as well. So I think for me, that's the tension that I see by giving such a kind of profound meaning to any structure or infrastructure that is there, because I understand that in your examples, there is something that is celebrated, that is elevated, but if there is death, it's also a death that is celebrated in certain ways. And in this case, yeah, it's difficult to know what to celebrate. Like, and obviously, yeah, it's to celebrate the victims in a way and their lives and recognize them, but not the way in which they were murdered, right? So I don't know how the sacrality of that place, how to mediate those. Sorry.
Well, I think it's a really good point, because I appreciate all the comments. Proposing we build like a, oh, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. No?
I think you're like covering something. Or...
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay, hopefully it stays. I'm not proposing we build a step pyramid, just so that's clear. But I think it's really interesting. So I think there's the Jewish frame, which Robert Jan is such an expert in. Obviously, Ilya is showing that there's actually an expanded frame. And then I think also, Marina, your point about, like I was showing sort of technology of the transcendent, but from a contemporary, like modern, whatever, 2020, 21st century kind of perspective, it could perhaps get interpreted as being a celebration of murder or something, right? So I think like having all of those perspectives in play and being able to turn the dials on which one's most important is kind of like the needle to thread eventually, because like I would hope that we wouldn't have to completely throw out the idea of sort of like the technology of memorialization in a way, but I wouldn't want to do it if it were entirely counter to Jewish metaphysics, Jewish culture, etc. And so that's what I'm interested in, is finding out, is there where are the bridges, but then not just between Judaism and other cultures, but also contemporary perspectives.
Yeah, and I can imagine that maybe what you are also bringing is this idea of a type of technology, call it technology, that is also healing in a way, like in the larger sense of the way of healing, in a way of connecting cycles of life and death with the larger forces of the universe. And in a way, yeah, bringing that type of sense to that place that otherwise wouldn't have. So yeah, just trying to understand also what Robert Jan mentioned about how the victims will relate also to whatever we will propose to that side. If we keep in mind that we repeated session after session, that in a way we are here for those who were murdered. Sorry.
No, but I wanted actually, I mean, when you're speaking about technologies, I think that this is quite a relevant thing, because Troy, one of the things that you showed is actually like the proto-transcendental technology was the cave, right? And the way that you kind of understood metaphor and this kind of transcendental experience was actually, it reminded me a lot of the way that Ilya, you were originally kind of conceiving the use of technology, right? And you were kind of looking at it through kind of what we now, when we say technology, we look at it and we think of like virtual reality, right? Or augmented reality. But so Troy, I mean, maybe you can kind of elaborate a bit more on what this word to you means, technology, but then also how this kind of ancient form of technology, thinking of the cave as a technology, also sits in relationship to, you know, like VR as a technology that I know that you're working with.
Yeah, I think the reason I'm using technology is because I think humans have certain capacities for experience that are beyond just what we're experiencing right now on a Zoom call. So changing states of consciousness through chemicals, through breathing, through rhythm, through whatever, allows us to have different experiences. And I feel like one of those experiences, in my experience of it, the truly profound experience of changing consciousness feels like you're tasting death. And so I think there's something about using that technology to, and nobody can ever know that because nobody's ever died and come back to tell us whether or not they think they have or whatnot, right? So it's the ultimate unknown, but I think there's an interesting way for that technology to give almost like a sympathy for the dead. And even if it's a simulated experience or whatever, it has that taste and that flavor. And actually that's where I'm not, I'm not so sure about virtual reality because it hacks your senses in a way that I feel like it's almost like a metaphor for it. This is my fear about attempting to do such things with like virtual reality, is it's sort of like refined sugar. So like refined sugar is bad for you because when you eat it, your body isn't able to process it. But if you have a piece of fruit with a bunch of sugar in it, it has all the vitamins and everything else that go along with it. And so you're able to kind of release it into your body and make sense of it. And so I wonder like if you can really simulate that experience, or if you have to find a different way of doing it, say more authentically or analog wise, that might just be like lower dosage. And that would be a kind of like open question for me.
Can I just weigh in for a moment? And this is I just want to throw in a complete different piece. Many of the people who were murdered in Babin Yar were murdered because their murderers had a ideology, anti-Semitism. And what basically is a problem with Nazi anti-Semitism, the particular form of anti-Semitism that ultimately created the Holocaust, is that it actually is rooted in a kind of green consciousness. Quite often it's being said the Nazis were the first Greens. That the Theosophical movement, the Anthroposophic movement, that is Western movements which in some way went back to these esoteric bodies of knowledge, were actually feeders to Nazism. And so we are here in a kind of, we're in some way in a very, I would say, problematic loop potentially. That many of the arguments that you presented today would have been profoundly sympathetic to a man like Heinrich Himmler. In fact, he loved this kind of stuff. He sent expeditions. I mean, he believed in this kind of stuff. Wewelsburg, the center of the SS, was supposed to be one of those cultic centers. He was interested in numerology and so on. Now, and I don't think that this is accidental, because in the Nazi anti-Semitism, the form of anti-Semitism as the Nazis preached it, as they developed it, the Jews were really seen, or not the Jews, but the Jew were seen as the great disturber of that unity. Quite rightly so. I mean, it is an accusation that in some way the Jews carry into history. I mean, they have been the people who basically disturbed the, I think, the unity of nature and history that existed in the mythic world by defining a single God who created the world and who has a covenant with people. And so I think we're on a somewhat dangerous path here. I don't want to say that it's impossible to thread a needle, as you say, but I think it's a difficult one. And I do not necessarily think that whatever we do in Babin Yar should also be an approach that could be in some way glorified by the very people who actually created the occasion for us to do so, that is by anti-Semites.
maybe also not mentioning the fact that the Nazis were having these drug abuses. And when you read Jonathan Littell's story, it's actually the protagonist, especially in Babin Yahr. He's kind of also under sort of some horrible pain, which then makes him actually witness the Babin Yahr shooting. I mean, it's like, that's really far from what Troy's beautiful presentation was trying to say, but as Robert Jan already mentioned the continuities, maybe there was another one which was kind of bizarre in the background. But thank you, Troy. I had just another kind of observation which struck me when you showed actually the serpent in Ohio. Or like actually all this, also in the Amazon, these kind of, let's say, sites, burial sites, or at least kind of prints of former inhabitation that comes through the vegetation. I thought this was also something we could learn from for that site, no? That actually, at the moment, it does not show, let's say, from above, right? It's just, it's landscape. But to think of it as something that we would experience as the kind of the sublime of a site, when we see all of a sudden from the air that is actually, it's making the shape of a serpent, right? So that kind of moment of where there's something that you wouldn't understand on the ground, but it's kind of overwhelming when you understand there's something coherent that actually runs through. So I feel there's also an idea for that site to think of it as of having quite literally a kind of a figure, rather than just the kind of the natural footprint and like natural site, but actually, I mean, that is recognizable on a different level.
Thank you. I want to give the space to Elizabeth, who I've seen trying to chime in now. So I hope that's okay. Oh, okay. And Robert Jan needs to leave. Okay. Bye, Robert Jan. Thank you.
Bye. Sorry for that, but class calls.
Thank you, Robert.
It's okay.
Bye.
Bye.
It's okay. Yeah, Elizabeth, please. Elizabeth, can you hear us? No? Okay. Well, so Ines, I mean, to your point of kind of the perspectivalism, right? I think that's a very interesting point, right? How also there were various examples that Troy showed, kind of how how appearances change, right? And not just how the appearance and the perception of forms change, but how the forms themselves change, right? And kind of the creation of let's say a form within space, a material form within space, is also something that oftentimes it's kind of incomplete, right? And it needs to be kind of activated by something else, right? And so sometimes, like, you know, it's this idea, right, of like the moon coming in at a certain moment, or the sun coming in at a certain moment. But I think, you know, Troy was also showing kind of the level to which, or let's say the complexity to which this kind of this figuration of form, I think, can actually be implemented, just kind of depending on what sort of perceptual framework you kind of take on.
I don't want to comment on it, but it's where I thought some conversation could go.
I think it's great that so many point of view exist, and they are now all this invisible point of view now is visible, and it's so amazing. And to see it's the question of form, and what kind of form and what kind of content, if we can try to combine all this
yeah, like to have in layers. Yeah,
yes, to have in layers, and maybe try to move the general ideas from the research what you did for each of you for all life, probably to move it to try to shift it to practical projection, visible or invisible, to the things in Babin Yar. Ines, thank you so much for your beautiful presentation, what you sent it to us. I think it makes sense to make a Zoom call or to have just conversation and to share and to compare things, what is already done in the process of doing by Maxim Rahmanika, the guy who does 3D modeling and in a way kind of forensic things. And he already did a lot and he's in the process, and he's inspired by things what Eyal doing, but there is a lot of things what can be, what can be combined. But I think if we can get Troy, if you have some time for us for next couple of weeks, if we can try to involve you more, it will be amazing if it's possible.
Yeah, Anna and I need to catch up, so we'll probably speak tomorrow and we can talk about how to plan that out with Nick as well.
One question, like, because I mean, now Robert Jan left also if we think of this whole thing as a burial ground, can we think of the whole area really as this kind of cemetery, or what Nick was actually sharing with us, this kind of necropolis? And I think that is really something where I can see an idea for a museum or for a monument, a memorial coming along on that scale somehow. And so it's something that involves, and I think I'm very inspired by Troy's beautiful presentation, or at least like also reopening our imagination for that, and actually bringing a completely different context and kind of take on it into that conversation, which seems to be like limited in a way and full of already existing references, right? But to think that whole park again as that necropolis, right, or like as a burial ground, I think it's a very strong sort of scale to think in, rather than, I mean, let's say there is the synagogue as a point, but there's also this, what are the gestures that even if not everything can be declared a site for, let's say, only for Babin Yar, it can be like through like almost immaterial or like through different forms and let's say gestures. I think of the Eruf, which is also something the Robert Jan had spoken about, right? This very simple measure of just creating a kind of a second Jerusalem just by a line, and that line could be a string of wires, and that would be connected to some posts just to create the continuity, and you just need the rabbi just declaring that area complete, right? So, and if there's something that one could just experience that site as a cemetery, even if it goes around, let's say the kind of the kiosk Ilya was mentioning, or a building that has been built in it, or like a playground, it would just embrace it all, but through a different gesture. And I can see somehow this is where one could place a competition, and rather than that we are suggesting it. I mean, I would have also ideas on how to do it, but maybe to kind of think of this kind of these gestures for landscape art memorial, yeah, that would address it in such a gentle way, rather than manifesting it like intrusively. It's just something you experience when you look for it, or you're surprised by it, finding it.
I had just a comment and a question. The question was about what can be built and what could be built and what cannot be built. It's not only about the appropriatedness of the building, it's also about the very fact of building something on the site instead of using the site in a certain way. And I was very interested by the picture that you shown of the snake in the land, which is also a way of using the earth that, to my point of view, has to be considered very seriously, because the dead are not only in the earth, they are dissolved in the earth, so they are the earth. So you can't simply think about building something and starting by excavating, because the soil you are going to remove is a part of what is remaining, because the chemistry of the disintegration of a human body make that the body and the earth are combined. So I was wondering if we should...
Yeah, we discussed that last day. I think the conversation last week was fully aligned with what you are saying now. It was all about the relation between the foundations or the soil or whatever might be built on top of that. So I agree with you. I mean, you were not in that conversation, but just to let you know that is indeed one of the main points we are discussing.
I've been interested because you have shown a lot of things built in stone, but you can also build in wood or in earth or in various material. And I was wondering if the fact that when you build in stone, you build in a certain way for the building to last forever. And when you are building with other materials, you incorporate the idea that maybe the gesture is appropriate for today, but maybe it won't be for the day after tomorrow. And we will be able to change it because it's made of leaves and wood and sand, maybe. But this question of building and not building, I like the places where people have prepared something and at the last moment not build the thing that they were preparing. And these issues of building not being built is also an interesting one to incorporate in our reflection.
I should say that the idea to build something from the earth was the first idea when Anna came, and after this idea, I immediately invited her to stay with us because it was a great idea that you're coming inside the body. And we also checked some of the examples of architectural building, especially in Russia, because in Russia was a tradition.
In Ukraine also, yeah.
In Ukraine also, to things still exist from the earth. But I think it's definitely important to have it's I like the idea of necropolis, of cemetery, but is the question of how we communicate with that, because in the usual tradition, you just come with respect, the silence. It's not a live place. If you're looking from the, let's say, Troy point of view. It's a different point of view to have a deal with that. And this is, I think, very interesting way also to communicate communicate with the past and with the souls, if somebody believes on it, like me, for example. But I think it's, you know, it's a big part of Babin Yar is a cemetery, but another big part is not cemetery. It's I cannot say it is most joyful place in the world, because psychiatric hospital is not most joyful place, or like beautiful church is not joyful place. But in general, it's I think this variety of possibilities to do things there. It's kind of unique chance. It's that it's not just like that. It can be very different. I need to run for next call. Thank you so much. And if you can have a conversation with Troy, I mean, like with each of you, like separately, just discuss what kind of things can be done, because I would love to have all of you like a co-authors of the concept, because you already did something magic there. You're magically part of it anyway. That's why I think it's already happened in a way. But
yeah, well, so Ilya, I mean, maybe if you can get Valeria to set up meetings, I think, you know, we'd all be happy to speak with you about this.
Just do it in the next couple of days, just day by day. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Charlotte.